You're watching Chicago's very own WGN News with Larry Potash, Robin Baumgarten, Paul Conrad, Pat Tomasulo, Anna Bellaball, and Courtney Hall. This is WGN Morning News at 9.
Welcome back. Coming up this half hour, we'll talk to a psychologist about the epidemic of high-powered men abusing women and his test to predict if someone may become a harasser.
Plus live music from London artist Bruno Major. All
But
that
first,
coming up.
This from Al Capone and Harold Washington to Marshall Field and more. A new photography book reveals an extensive tour of the final resting places of Chicago's famous, infamous, and often overlooked.
Chicago Eternal features hundreds of photos of notable gravestones, monuments from more than 30 different cemeteries, along with little-known facts about the deceased. The author and photographer Larry Broutman spent 5 years putting this together, and it's a book that is heavy. Ugh. How much does that weigh? 5 pounds? Wow. Do people say this is kind of a gruesome subject to cover, or no?
No, not really. You know, because the history of Chicago can be told by visiting the cemeteries in Chicago and by noting who all the people, you know, famous Chicagoans buried in the cemeteries. So one can really relate the history of Chicago really well by going to cemeteries, and you'd be surprised how many people are involved in associations and organizations that tour cemeteries.
Let's take a look at the first gravestone we're looking at, called the Sisters. What is this? Let's see if we can see the photo here right now.
There we go.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
The Sisters is, in fact, I passed it this morning. It's at Wunders Cemetery on Irving Park. It's really probably one of the most beautiful and touching cemetery monuments I came across. And it is, you can see, actually the statue was created in 1906, so it's well over 100 years old. And two sisters that were Chicagoans survived the rest of their family who died before them. And then the sisters always lived together. They were very close. They never got married.
Wow.
And when the older sister died, the younger sister commissioned, we don't know whom, but probably a world-class sculptor that was in Chicago in about 1906. Probably here because of the Columbian Exposition of 1893.
Look at that.
And that is just an incredibly beautiful and touching sculpture.
Wow.
All right, let's go on to Bobby Franks. This is it's a sad story associated with this.
Bobby Franks, really a sad story. You know, his murder has been referred to as crime of the century. Leopold and Loeb. Loeb was his cousin. They were only 19 or 20 years old. They were considered child prodigies, and they decided to try to commit the perfect crime.
And it's horrible. Is this the family plot here?
Yes, the mausoleum. Bobby Franks is buried there. His father and mother are also buried there.
Oh, and where is that?
That's at Rose Hill Cemetery.
Okay, all right.
And let me tell you the really ironic thing about that. Leopold and Loeb, who murdered him, their families are buried within probably 100 yards of Bobby Franks. The families all knew each other.
Oh, it's terrible.
Let's take a look at Capone's tombstone.
And this is located where?
Al Capone is now at Mount Carmel Cemetery. Interesting thing, you know, Al Capone and Chicago are kind of synonymous in many respects. Al Capone was born in 1899, and he basically moved to Chicago when he was only about 20 years old, and he ran the Chicago outfit. At the age of 24 or 25, he became the head of the Chicago, in a sense, the Chicago outfit. And he was, of course, responsible. He's buried at, as I said, Mount Carmel. He was moved from Mount Olivet Cemetery because people were trying to get souvenirs off of his grave. They had to move him, encase him in concrete. And now he's at Mount Carmel Cemetery, and probably the most visited cemetery monument in the city of Chicago.
That's bizarre.
Last one, Marshall Field.
Marshall Field, absolutely beautiful monument. Marshall Field basically, and his family are buried at Graceland Cemetery. And if you can see in the background, the monument was designed and sculpted by Daniel Chester French, who did the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. And you can see the similarity between the two. So it's just a beautiful monument to the Marshall Field family.
So in addition to having famous Chicagoans' final resting place in this book, you have a lot of these interesting stories of just beautiful headstones and mausoleums that you've encountered throughout Chicagoland, right?
Right. The book is full of stories, 300 stories of Chicagoans buried in Chicago cemeteries.
Well, it's fascinating. It's called Chicago Eternal. Larry Broutman, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.
It'll be available in stores on March 6th. It's heavy, but it's a good coffee table book.
It is definitely that.
And you'll be appearing April 3rd at 6:30 at City Light Books on North Kedzie. And there's the information. Thank you, Larry.
I appreciate your having me here.
Good to see you.